Welcome to San Francisco.
Thank you, Chris Lehane. So, this enterprise is active in 6 states or 7?
7.
Where do you think you guys have had the most impact?
I mean, they've targeted 1 million climate voters across those 7 states and turned them out and then elevated the issue. I mean, climate has ended up being a top 3 issue in almost every single state. In fact, in every single state that we just talked about. So the mere fact that from a macro perspective, the Democrats are playing offense on climate and using it as a wedge issue, to me, is a pretty significant achievement. And that was specifically Tom Steyer's objective. He called this year a pivot year for climate, which is, can we begin to use it as an offensive issue against people who deny the science? And when you begin, as you've written extensively in politics, know it as well as anyone out there, once you're scoring points on an issue and the other side's playing defense, that's the first step you get to ultimately getting real policy change. The state that we've spent the most resources in, and at some level it's reflective of the size, is Florida. And I think that there's a lot of interesting stuff that we have accomplished in Florida. First of all, just stepping in with the financial wherewithal, at a time when the Democrat was being vastly outspent. We have injected the issue in such a significant way that the Republican incumbent, Rick Scott, in August, after we have went up and after we did a variety of events, actually announced his own environmental agenda. And by the way, the word environment hadn't come from his lips in his 4 years as governor. The policy issues had been in whatever his equivalent of a policy witness protection program was or is. And he's out there talking about the environment. He actually met with climate scientists, I think dug himself a deeper hole as a result by saying he really didn't actually understand the science. But he's been someone who's really been on the defensive on it. All the data out there indicates it has been a top 3 issue. We have data that suggests it's the most discussed issue in the state across social media, paid media, and free media press. And then I point you to 2 things in particular. One, huge Get Out the Vote program that focuses both on Latino voters statewide, but particularly in South Florida, and also millennials, a big voter registration absentee program. And I think some of the stuff you're already seeing as we sit here today in terms of the absentee count in Florida would suggest that the program is really manifesting itself because the absentee numbers right now are already better than they were in 2010 from the Democratic perspective. But in particular, I'd point folks to the Tampa market. Early on, we took a look at the state. Tampa tends to be the market that really, the I-4 corridor, as you know, from presidential politics is really critical to whoever wins and loses Florida. In particular, Tampa was an interesting market. It's a market where the Republican registration basically has a 1 or 2 point advantage. It's effectively where Rick Scott beat Alex Sink in 2010. My numbers may be a little bit off, but I think he won the election by about 61,000 votes, and 35,000 of them came from Tampa. And so back in February, we took a look at the state and said, can we move the dial there? Everything holds chalk, right? Everything goes exactly like 2010. Can you flip 20, 30,000 votes, for a 50, 60 vote, delta, in Tampa alone? And so we went through a pretty extensive exercise to identify an issue and came across this issue, which involves an out-of-state energy company utility called Duke Energy, which has been gouging voters in Tampa for the last 4 or 5 years. They've given $1.2 million and counting to Rick Scott in campaign contributions, and he's allowed the gouging to continue. And so we took what was a hyper-local issue and really elevated it and put television behind it. It is now the dominant issue in that market. We've seen significant erosion in his numbers in that market, which we think at some level accounts for where the race is today being 10 days or so out from the election. His numbers are underwater compared to where they were there in 2010. And so I think it's an interesting example of how you identify an issue which would not necessarily be, the issue that you would think of that has a direct connection to climate, energy, and the environment, elevate it and use it as an issue. And it works at every single level.
Do you think there's any way that given the spending in that race and given some of the disparities involved, do you think there's any way that Charlie Crist could conceivably have been where he is now without you guys?
We faced this conversation back in August of this year, which is that there looked like there was going to be a $20, $25, $30 million gap between the amount of money that Charlie Crist would be able to spend and the amount of money that Rick Scott was going to spend. And you looked at where the numbers were in August, and you saw the weight of the negative arguments being launched against Crist by Scott, really beginning to have an impact. And so we made a decision that to keep this race competitive and try to. And it was interesting. So we spent 6 weeks with a real buy on this Duke Energy issue, with the short-term goal of trying to see could we stabilize the race. what we found actually is not only did we stabilize the race, but we actually moved the race in a good direction. All that said, right, we could have done all that stuff, and if Charlie Crist isn't out there campaigning and delivering and really doing his piece, right, you could spend a lot of that money and it wouldn't have had an impact. I mean, it was the combination, I think, of all those factors.
Is there another race that you would much more briefly highlight as a place where you feel like your impact had been close to as significant there?
I do Michigan. And when we got into Michigan, the Democrat was behind. And he said, I'm going to make environment, the compare and contrast, the issue in this race. And then what we ended up doing in Michigan is really highlighting the fact that in Detroit, there is the dirtiest zip code in Michigan. We highlighted an actual person from that community. And we even did things where we took a soil test that we made public from that zip code in Detroit and compared it to a soil test of the Republican nominees' property. Actually, it was a park across from her property. But
it's a very Lehanian tactic.
Yeah, well, but it was one of those moments where, and the toxicology report in this neighborhood was high toxins, cancer causing, really dangerous, and she had very nice land, right? And Michigan is a state that people would not intuitively or typically think is a pro-climate, pro-environment state. In fact, there are reasons it is, but people intuitively wouldn't necessarily think that. And then to see the race really turn, with this issue being the turning point, I think is really significant and a pretty important takeaway, particularly as you head into 2016, given the import of places like Florida, Michigan, some of these other places, and even got to a point where our ads, which focused on the relationship of the Kochs to that toxic land in Detroit, was so powerful that the Koch money eventually pulled itself out of Michigan because they had become such a negative that even when they ran their ads in effect were negatives against themselves because people were asking so many questions about it.
For you, Chris Lehane, what are the three takeaways about climate politics from this cycle and the way in which organizations like this and the money that they spend matter now and will matter in the future?
Sure. Takeaway one is that being a science denier is ultimately a path to political extinction. Point two, that you're in a time period when people really are beginning to look at where the money comes from. The collective sophistication of the public is pretty impressive on that. And so the role of outside money is going to be enormously impactful, but people are going to ask questions about where that money is coming from. And point three, and I think this is going to be the case for the short term in American politics, which is there's a very, 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 very narrow band of people who are actually really up for grabs in these elections. They're called the super shifters. Most of these elections are locked in at 45-45, 48-48, and you have to win your fair share of those super shifters, but then you really have to maximize your voter pool. And the combination of those two things is what makes or breaks winning or losing.